All right, I'll get rolling here. I think it's actually lecture 19, but I'm still a slide deck behind. So we're kind of a lecture behind, so it was kind of a sad thing. I had to delete some slides from this slide deck so we can catch up a little bit, because we're about to embark on some things I really enjoy talking about. I have to get these this next chapter up and rolling. I haven't done that yet, but it will be up by the end of the day today. First, thoughts on the exam. First of all, just in terms of logistics and overall ability, you guys are crushing it. I mean, it's really heartening for me to see everybody sort of, first of all, take the exam. It seems like in the past I always had a hard time just logistically getting everybody through the exam in timely fashion. That was great. And then the average was something like an 80. And so, of course, there's always people who don't do as well as they would like. Once again, we can talk about that stuff. But, there's a lot of other things you can do to support your grade. And, keep improving. The other thing I'll say is we're about to change gears pretty abruptly. So even if you've kind of struggled with everything we've done in class, it's going to take on a different timbre. And I find that a lot of students relatively early on form a preference for micro or macro. And it's one reason why in my Eco 100 class I spend a lot more time with macro than I think most of my colleagues, because I know that a lot of students find it they have a natural affinity for the subject. So before I dive in, I'm not going to say a lot about the exam. The drill is the same as last time. Please take a look at your grade scope exam, complain about points, put in a regrade request. I like that system because I have a record of everything we've said and done. So please do that. If you complain about how I graded, you might wind up helping everybody else out, right? A positive externality for your classmates. And if you have trouble accessing your exam or something else kind of happened with GradeScope, let me know and we'll iron that out as well. Yes? The final exam is not cumulative, right? We worked pretty hard on microeconomics, but let's just, start again and just kind of come down the stretch and do some macro, and that'll be our final exam. That's kind of my plan. It gives us 5 classes to talk about, and you'll see that there's a lot to talk about here. There's a couple things I'll say about this. So I think the way things are set up, I looked at the website at Hunter. Our last class is going to be the 19th. And then the final exam is 2 days after that. And I kind of like that setup because then we can do our review and all that stuff, and it'll be fresh in your mind for the exam 2 days later. The other thing I'll remind you of is that we have 2 hours and it starts later, right? So I look at this and I say to myself, thank God, all the pressure is off of me. I don't have to be here at 8:20 handing out exams in hurried fashion, trying to get everybody in and out of the classroom. And maybe you can relax a little bit too, because I'm not going to make the exam longer or anything like that. It'll be about the same as the previous two. I mean, what's the point? As we will see when we talk about economics or macroeconomics, expectations are important, right? And I've spent 2 exams now kind of establishing what I expect from you on exams. So why would I change it? Heading down the pike here, right? So we'll keep it about the same. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in here and we'll start talking about macroeconomics. Now, macro is obviously different than micro. You think macro, you think big. Micro, you think small, right? Well, that is really what macroeconomics is all about. It's kind of like thinking about all markets at once, right? Of course, that's a little unsatisfying without some better organizing principles. So typically what we have in mind is we have this larger view of what, our old friends productive and allocative efficiency, right? That is to say, we're still interested in producing things as efficiently as possible, and we're still interested in allocating things to the people who need them most, right? But what we want to do is think about how this happens in general or across the economy, right? In particular, what we're going to do is take those ideas about efficiency and we're going to relate them to these aggregate variables. And in fact, a lot of people would describe macro as bullet point number 2 there. It's just a theory that describes interrelations between aggregates, right? Computed aggregates. So you've probably heard what I mean by aggregate variables. I mean these things that measure economy-wide performance, right? Gross domestic product. Everybody's heard of something like that. We're going to talk about exactly what it is, of course. Of course, maybe you've heard of some of the variants of gross domestic product. There is per capita gross domestic product. There is real per capita gross domestic product, and that's going to be the thing we look at the most. Interest rates, right? There's many different interest rates. Maybe you even think about, but you often hear things like, well, the interest rate did this in response to that, right? We're going to talk a lot about that, right? What an interest rate is and how it relates to the efficiency questions and why we would expect them to go up and down in a macroeconomic context. Inflation, right? Another one, right? That talks about prices in general, right? Whether they're going up or down. And so we're going to sort of take that and the next thing, the unemployment rate, right? And we're going to weave those things all together into a macroeconomic theory, right? That explains how the whole economy works. And then think about, how we would like these things to work. And that will inform my first bullet point. Of course, then what you can kind of do is you can fill in some of the gaps kind of fall into place, or some of the finer points. Once you have a theory about how these things work, you can kind of see how the stock market fits into the picture, how stuff like housing starts as measures of economic activity, jobs created, all these things that you hear about in the news, right? Really, the great thing about all of this is our theory is going to come down to just thinking about supply and demand once again, right? So what we're going to say here is really, to kind of foreshadow a little bit where this is going, we're going to treat Q, the horizontal axis quantity, that's going to be something like GDP, gross domestic product, right? How much of everything we produce, right? P is going to be treated as something like a consumer price index, or prices in general. And then we're going to put together aggregate demand and aggregate supply on this diagram. It's going to be really, I'm getting excited just thinking about it, because it's that much fun. So one of the big realizations you get out of this, or I hope you get out of this, is that everything is kind of interrelated, and this matters for how you sort of picture the way the world works, right? So I have one example here where you think about firms selling goods. They sell stuff at prices. You buy your phone, coffee, computers, whatever. They then pay their workers and also earn something like profit, right? But ultimately what happens is the wages, when they sell goods, the wages and profits that they pay are somebody else's income, right? Which is maybe mundane to say that, but it's also something that needs to be said, right? Ultimately, when a firm makes profits, that becomes someone's income, right? And then, of course, what people do with that income, the wages and profits firms earn, is they buy the goods that maybe even the firm itself sells, right? So you have to appreciate this circular flow, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about it, right? This idea that wages become income, become purchases, become profits, become wages, so on and so forth. So the other thing you need to do with macro, maybe more so than micro, is you really need a collection of kind of historical facts, right? You have to sort of think about the big things that have happened in world history, because in some ways they really can sort of tell you why the theory is created the way it is. So the big events that I'm thinking of, and we'll talk about what actually happened in these big events. The Great Depression, that was a big one, right? We'll talk a lot about that. The inflationary 1970s, that was when I was a kid, and we had some serious inflation. We have this, if you want to think about the larger stretch of history, this is going to be a subject we think about as well, is the onset of modern growth, which is this crazy thing that sometime right around, we'll say, 1776, I'll just pick that year out of thin air. The world started growing, right, in some parts faster than others, at a rate of about 3% per year, right, the amount of stuff that the world could create. And it just kind of kept going for a couple of centuries, right? And that brought us from old-timey times to modern day. So it's a big question, though. Why did it start then? And what has growth looked like over this couple of centuries period. We've had other things. People have talked about how growth has slowed down over the last couple of decades. There's this period called the Great Moderation, which is over the last 30 or 40 years, inflation has kind of mellowed out a bit relative to the previous. Question, yes?
I was going to say, don't like all historical like tragedies affect the economy in some way? Like, you can look at it from the perspective of like how cheap the flights were during September 11th, 2001.
Oh.
And all other aspects of that around like how cheap the travel to Hawaii was during the floods and the fire.
We're going to have a lot to say about these, right? Like you might see, what you're describing are what we will come to know as shocks, right, to the system. And I love a good historical shock more than most economists. And there's all kinds of these crazy shocks that happen all the time that you can use to kind of think about how economic activity works. Big example going way back in history is the bubonic plague, right? Which is if you're an economist, you view as a massive labor market shock, right? A contraction in the supply of labor, and you can think about how that played out over years and centuries, stuff like that. It's and this is at some point I'm going to sneak in a pitch for the economics major, and part of my pitch is that you can just anything that you enjoy you can think about using economics, and maybe ruin it. No, I'm just kidding. Not that last part. Okay, so circular flow. Let's think about this and unpack it a little bit. It's actually an idea that has been around for a little while, and it's been sort of said in different ways. Supply creates demand, or supply creates its own demand. Sometimes that's called Say's law, going back to the economist Jean-Baptiste Say, French economist. And I'll give you a very simple example. It really started to come into its started to grow as a technique in and of itself in the work of Francois Quesnay, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, right? Who was a French economist. You take history of thought with me one day. He was in the physiocrat. He was a physiocrat in the physiocratic school. They believed that all wealth came from the land. But he was also a physician who studied blood flow. In fact, he was the physician to the French king at the time. I think who would it have been? Louis the 14th, maybe. And it was interesting because he said a lot of stuff that was kind of disparaging, and said our policies about taxing peasants aren't great. What we want to do is not do that so much. Maybe tax the nobility. And somehow he got away with this stuff, saying this stuff kind of to the king himself. But anyway, suffice it to say that he was interested in how wealth flowed through the economy and how it sort of created new goods. And he thought about this in technical terms. And he had this device he called the tableau économique for studying this. And he had a famous zigzag table which described how this flow worked. Understanding this thing is really difficult, even when you spend an entire lecture on it, as I do. But suffice it to say, the zigzags are expenditures going from one group of people to another group of people. And the way he broke this down, the groups of people, he said, well, we have a productive class, those were farmers. We have a sterile class, those were manufacturers, right? Artisans, craftspeople, manufacturers, whatever. They were sterile because all they did was take raw materials and sort of make them into something else. Think about that a little bit. Whether that's really, not creating anything. And then there were landowners, and if you sort of look at this diagram, you can see that all the arrows kind of balance out. Point of interest, this idea that you could kind of separate the world into different groups of people based on their economic function, it becomes part of classical economics. And is actually, if you look at this a certain way, you can kind of see the thought of Karl Marx emerging, right? And indeed, a lot of what Karl Marx did was based on not particularly Quesnay's work, but Ricardo's work, where he talked about capitalists, right, landowners, and then workers, right, and how goods and things were distributed among these groups and how they flowed through the economy. We don't really do it this way. But some of the ideas are kind of there, and I don't know why I have an example where I'm a lumberjack here, or you're a lumberjack. But maybe it's just because it's kind of easy to picture how this all works. And really the idea is that in some way this applies to just about everybody in the economy, right? Is that you go to work and you do something and you earn money, right? And then ultimately what you do is you take the money that you've so earned and you go buy the stuff that you've in part created, right? You and other people in part have created. So in that sense, every piece of income out there becomes, firms' earnings, which then becomes someone's income, which then becomes earnings by firms, revenues by, I should say. But my example of a lumberjack is, you go out and you cut some wood, it goes to a sawmill, that goes to somebody who produces paper products, which then goes to a retailer. The retailer then, ships all these goods to stores. But then what you do with your money is you say, well, my daughter's starting school in the fall, so I'm going to go to the retailer Staples, and I'm going to buy some paper and some pencils, right? You've used the money that you earned as a lumberjack to actually buy the stuff that you in part created, right? That's how the world, not every example is that clear, but that's kind of how we think about it. And in my example, there was this kind of idea lurking in the background. And this is how we're going to sort of organize our view of how the circular flow works, even though it's really not quite this simple. So we're not going to have, the sterile class and landowners and the productive class of farmers. We're going to just break everything into households and firms, right? So there's businesses and there's people, if you want to think about it that way. And what sort of happens is households, we own all the stuff in the end, right? That includes your time and your labor, right? Also your ideas and your thoughts about what to do, but also capital, right? People ultimately own all the businesses and firms out there. I mean, you might think it's strange to say it that way because, Elon Musk owns a lot more of one business than, say, I do. But I have mutual funds, right? I'm saving up for retirement. And what I'm really doing is owning pieces of firms and buying mutual funds, right? That's what a stock is. You own some of their actual capital or some of the business. So we own all that stuff, right? My savings and my labor and all that stuff and my ideas. I supply those things to factor markets, right? That's where firms go to buy these things. Labor, capital, new ideas, know-how, all of those things, right? So we interact with firms, people interact with firms in factor markets. That's where they get their inputs, as we'll call them. And then they create output, as we might call it, goods and services supplied. Those all go into goods markets, right? And that's where we go we take, ultimately those goods all go to households. So I'm stumbling around a little bit because really the circular flow is kind of going in two directions at once, right? One flow goes clockwise and one goes counterclockwise. The way I've drawn this up, the counterclockwise flow is the stuff, right? The inputs going into the factor markets to firms, firms to goods, back to households. The other direction goes the money, right? The cash. So you can think about the red thing here is people buying stuff. That becomes revenue for firms. Well, then, once firms get their revenue and pay their bills and everything, that creates rent that they have to pay for their properties, wages they pay their employees and salaries. They pay interest to banks on loans, and then profits, right, are distributed to shareholders. That all goes back into the factor market, right, as payment for the things that people have given the firm to produce, right? So maybe I'm overstating it, but it's kind of a neat way to view the world, right? Of course, there is this thing called government, which oversees this whole process and plays a pretty important role in it, right? It collects taxes, right, at all kinds of levels, income taxes, corporate taxes, state taxes, right, city taxes. We have those too, right? And what does it do with them? Well, it buys goods and services and stuff like that as well, right? And does things like maintain roads. So it provides some products and services as well that hopefully help society run. Maybe even help society create more than it otherwise could, right? There's also transfer payments, right? And that's essentially where, the government collects taxes and then takes some of those tax dollars and gives them to some people, right? And so that's more or less just a transfer from one group of people to another. Things like Social Security, unemployment insurance fall into this category, welfare payments, things like the pandemic PPP, the Paycheck Protection Plan. And just to start this process where I'm trying to give you some facts about what these things look like, well, I can start to jump in. We'll get used to seeing all this stuff. So the federal budget, and maybe I'll ask a question here. You can see this is kind of what it looked like in a recent year. In 2023, I'll go here. You can see that the government is spending about, $7 trillion in a year. Does anybody know what GDP is in the United States? Somebody look it up. Gross domestic product, does anybody know what it was last year in 2025, the number? We don't even really know what it is yet. I'm just throwing it out there so we can kind of... What's that?
At least 2 cents.
Let's see, ChatGPT, anybody? What was GDP last year? Here, I'll look. What was gross domestic product in the United States last year, ChatGPT? 30.7 trillion. Okay. So if you want to think about 6.1 divided by 30, what is that? About 20%? So about 20%, 6.1 trillion amounts to about 20% of the money spent in a year. ChatGPT just keeps going on and on. So it's a lot of money, right? It's a big player in this circular flow. All right, keep moving here. I'm doing pretty well. So if you want to position government and make your, kind of close the flow diagram, maybe this is how you do it. You just plop government in the middle. You can see that it's collecting taxes from households and firms, right? And then it's transferring money back and forth, but it also buys goods and services in the goods market. For example, it buys, tar and asphalt and, garbage trucks and hires people and all that stuff to fill in potholes. Okay, so I started throwing some numbers at you there, but what we want to do is we want to be a little bit more detail-oriented about this. Remember, we're trying to think about aggregate numbers, aggregate variables here. So what we want to do is measure the flow, right, and talk about how big that circular flow is from year to year or across times. And this will, allow us to compare and contrast things and think about policy and all that stuff. So we need to measure, right? We didn't talk about this much in micro, but in macro it's important. And we really almost run smack into a problem right off the bat. And that if we're trying to measure aggregate output, we have the apples and oranges problem, right? We can't just say that we produced 1,000 apples and 1,000 oranges, 1,000 bananas and 1,000 cars, and therefore we produced 4,000 things last year, right? That doesn't make much sense as a measure of total output, right? Some of those, not all of those things are the same. Apples and oranges, you might argue they're round fruits. You could add those together, but you're not going to throw into the, you're not going to say, well, we're going to have fruits and cars and computers and, college educations and all that stuff. How do we add up all those things, right? Well, you probably won't be surprised to know that what we do is we just kind of add up the dollar value of everything, and we talk about that, right? So we can say, well, if we produced a car, that adds $40,000 to overall output, and if we produce 1,000 oranges and 1,000 apples, each of those sells for $1 a piece. So we would take the $40,000 in automobile, and then we would add $1,000 of apples and $1,000 of oranges. So there we've solved this problem where now we have everything in the same units, right? We just add up the dollar value of everything. So I guess I don't have to show you, but I had Kirkland brand here. That's the Costco brand, because people aren't so troubled by this. With Costco, you say, oh, Costco earned $2.35 billion. This was 10 years ago. I think they're up to 10 or 12 billion in profits nowadays, or total sales. I'll have to look. But we don't really worry about it so much, even though Kirkland makes everything, right? They have Kirkland brand milk, underwear, diamonds, cruises, right? But we're still completely comfortable with that. So we do the same thing for the economy on the whole. Okay, so now we have a way of kind of measuring the flow, right? We're just going to think about the total dollar value of everything created. I know you probably have a million questions about that, but we're going to get to those. The good news is, if we look at this picture here, let's leave government out of it for now. This suggests, as a theoretical idea, that we can sort of, if we go back to Kane and think about this as taking a pulse, right, of sort of a living organism, we can do it just about anywhere we want, right? So we could measure, we could put our finger on the pulse here and measure total product here by looking at how much income firms provide in a year, right? And that's one way of measuring the whole flow. We call it the sum of factor payments method. So you go out there and you say, how much did firms pay in dividends? How much did they pay in wages and salaries and for all that stuff? Add that up and we get a measure of total output. Well, we can also go over there and look at expenditures on goods and services, right, in the goods market, and just add that up, right? Total expenditures on goods and services. That's a little bit trickier because there's a little loop that goes here from firms to itself, and it turns out a lot of activity is firms buying stuff from other firms as they're going about production. We want to not do that, right? So we're going to, we just want to think about what we say is expenditures on final goods in the goods market. So that's one nice thing we can do, is just measure things there, right? Now, one of the problems we're going to run into is that if we're talking about year-to-year changes, say, in total output, well, a big problem is that prices change year-to-year as well, right? So even though we have a unit of measurement for total output, our unit of measurement is evolving over time, right? And also across places. So we're going to have to think about that as well. It's a complication, right? There's other complications we'll get to. So oftentimes what we want to do is what we're going to do is make a distinction between real variables, right? And you can think about it this way. That's really what I can do with the dollar, right? And nominal variables, which is kind of just like what it says it is, right? So in name is kind of what we would describe as a nominal variable. The way I think about a nominal, if you say nominal GDP, I say, okay, well, that hasn't been adjusted in any way to think about, prices and changes and stuff like that. A real variable, somebody has made an attempt to, control for changing prices over time. And don't worry, I'm going to show you how it's done. It's fascinating. Well, it's something. So one of the things that you get out of this is when you start thinking about things in real terms, it's an important thing from the perspective of an economist, right? Instead of just thinking about dollars, you start to think to yourself, well, what really matters is what I can do with those dollars, right? This can also help you. I know a lot of you have fascinating backgrounds from different places, but oftentimes you run into this problem when you go to another country. So a couple years ago I was in Iceland, and they have the Icelandic kroner, I believe, is the currency there. And you run into this problem as to, whether prices are high in Iceland, whether things are expensive. You don't really know from just looking at the kroner. Of course, if you translated a kroner into dollars, right, you could then make an assessment. But even then, you would probably say, well, the way I think about dollars is ultimately what I can buy for them, right? So my example here comes from Kentucky Fried Chicken, which for some reason is a very popular restaurant in Iceland. They're all over the place. Not many workers in Iceland. It's like one of the most highly automated places you'll ever see. So, is a KFC meal expensive in Iceland? That's kind of a question you might ask, right? Well, I might say the cost is about 2,769 Icelandic kroners. Does that seem expensive to you? It's a big number, right? But we don't really know anything about what a kroner is, or how, is that cents? Is that like an Icelandic penny? Is that a dollar? What is it? So one thing you can do is, what you typically do a lot, I didn't want to do that, is we do have this conversion tool here. So what did I say, 2767, close enough, right? So if I should get it right. 2769. So this quick little handy tool converts the kroner to dollars. So you can see that an Icelandic kroner, a Kentucky Fried Chicken meal, is about $22 in Iceland. Expensive? That seems like about, at least twice as much as it would cost in the United States, right? But the point is, sort of twofold, that you first have to translate, things into a common currency, and even then, right, you sort of think about it as, well, what can I buy with my money in the United States? You say, well, $22, I can buy 2 KFC meals, maybe, right? So we're going to kind of play this logic out in large and think about all of these problems and how to, think about the economy in general using some of these ideas. Another question, yes?
Don't we also have to consider cost of living? Like the worth of $20 here might be different from the worth of
It's exactly right. Yes, we have to think about, and this is kind of not only what are the dollars, but how do we spend, how much can we get with them? That's exactly kind of the idea. Cost of living adjustments is indeed one thing that you might think about, moving from a real to a nominal, or a nominal to a real variable. Yes?
But also the other variables will be the cost of even just getting the product to them because of where they're at, and that if we set all those variables.
You guys are doing pretty well there, right? So the way I might say that is the price level in general, the cost of living, say, depends on the interaction between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? And aggregate demand is kind of what you want to buy or what you can buy with your money. Aggregate supply is what firms can make, right? And so we're going to think about all of that. Good leading questions here. So we're going to do the same here, right? And this is really going to be a key how we can make these price adjustments and get some general principles for this, because you probably talk to your parents or your grandparents, and they love to tell you about how much I could get a soda, I could get a can of Coke back in the 70s, it was 30 cents, right? And you hear about all these things, and then you say to yourself, well, I say to myself anyways, you also worked all day for $5, right? And so what you want to do is you want to parse out these things and think about how, well, prices have changed, wages have changed. What does it all mean, right? And so we're going to have to learn how to decompose our output into these different sorts of things, changes in output and changes in prices. And we're going to do all that. It's fun. I think we'll enjoy it. Okay. So before even jumping into this, maybe I'll just sort of throw some numbers out in general, right? We have this measure of the price level. I put in some question marks there because this is how prices in general have changed over time, but I haven't told you how it's calculated yet. We'll get to that. Nominal GDP does exactly what I said it does. We just add up the total dollar value of everything created in the United States. You can think about this as total incomes or total expenditures on goods, and we just see what it looks like over time, right? So, and this gives you some idea what this stuff looks like over time. By the way, Fred, you have some experience with Fred, from an earlier, when I had you look at some prices. This is what nominal GDP looks like over time. And you can see when you don't think about, you just sort of take the experiment at face value. If you go back to 1950, it was about billions of dollars. So I'm trying to think what that would be, maybe 100 billion or something. And now it's up where we said it was 32 trillion, right? So it's grown a lot over time. But even in this diagram, you can see that there's these blips where it's actually gone down, right? Those are recessions. This, I guess, would be COVID. This would be the subprime mortgage meltdown, the dot-com crisis. This was the thing that happened in the early 90s. I don't know what the name was. We had the giant inflation-crushing recessions of the early 80s. We had the stagflation of the 70s. See, they all kind of had names, which is part of the reason for showing this. But if you sort of look at this, you say, wow, the economy has really grown over time. The problem is that prices have really grown over time, too. And they kind of look like over time. This is how the price level in general has increased. Right? And I know we haven't talked about how to actually calculate it. And indeed, that's kind of gone up, with a couple of weird blips. Here's the dot-com, the meltdown, the mortgage meltdown. Here's COVID. And you might be able to even start to say, well, I can see in these last two things anyways, that it looks like when the economy has sort of gone, south a little bit, the price level goes down at the same time. There's a good reason for that, and we'll get into that. But we don't really know, right? When we look at that nominal GDP, we don't really know if it's actual growth. That is to say, are we able to produce more and more as a society, or is it just prices going up, right? So we want to be able to separate those two things. And the typical way we do that is with real GDP, right? Which is where we remove the effects of changes in price and we look at GDP itself, right? We have a lot of tools for doing this. It's pretty exciting. But we also want to think about not just GDP in and of itself. We like to think about it in per capita terms a lot, which is where you just sort of take the number and divide it by the number of people, because the United States population has grown considerably over that time frame I showed you as well. I think it's more than doubled, right? I want to say it was 150 million or so in 1950, and now it's 350 million? But let's just let's see what we got here, real gross domestic product. If we remove the price increase, I guess it gets a little flatter. You can see that the 1950 number is no longer here, but moves up to here. And the 2025 number comes down from 32 to 24. But and you can see now the blips, the negative downturns a little bit more, right? COVID and the mortgage crisis. But still, one of the amazing things about this diagram is that it's just gone up and up and up, right? If I showed you the per capita diagram, it would be about the same. So, I can show you that. Let's look at that. So per capita, similar picture as well, right? So how do we measure all of these things, and how does it all work? Let's dive right in here. And while I'm sort of prepping this, maybe what I'll do is I'll fire up the attendance thing. And I will do my usual nonsense where I mess around with this and it goes sideways. Looks like I'm doing pretty well. Leave that there a while. Maybe I'll close this. Hey, that's pretty good, right? Okay. So to show you the basic principle on how we get all these real and not, yes?
So the real GDP is like the first number minus the what again?
Oh, okay. So real GDP is nominal GDP, but adjusted. It's GDP adjusted for changes in prices.
Okay.
And so in that sense, we say, well, it's really, why is it called real GDP? It's what you can really buy or what we've really created, I should say, in aggregate. And
Does that mean the process could be like reverse, and then like you could see like what would be like the opposite of like real GDP, like nominal GDP?
Yes, you can always work back and forth between these things. And maybe I can spin your question and say, once we sort of get through this, you'll be able to say, well, not only, what does it mean to earn $5 and be able to buy a Coke for 30 cents in 1972? You can say, if I had the money I have today, right, what would that have been in 1972, right? So you can kind of go backwards and forwards. You can say, what would my income today look like in the past? What would my purchases in the past look like today, right? And we're going to be able to work all the way back and forth between all of these things. But what I want to do is, it's more interesting than you might think, even though it's kind of a lot of basic accounting here. What I'm going to do is give you one of the simplest possible examples I can think of here that shows you how all of these principles work, right? And how we might measure changes in real GDP, right? And by real in this case, what I mean is changes in the actual amount of stuff we're producing, independent of how the value of the dollar is changing over time. Right? Question? Yeah.
Yeah, that was my mindset. It's like the only thing that's really changed is the valuation of the resources or whatever we need to produce those products.
Oh, okay.
The number of products, that's the true measurement.
Very good.
Is it not over the valuation, because valuations fluctuate
Right.
by diets, so to speak. But the numbers, like you say,
Right. Yeah, back in the 1970s, a gallon of gas was 30 cents, right? And now a gallon of gas is $4, right? But it's the same gallon of gas you're buying. What we care about is whether or not there's more gas. That's not bad, right? I got that about right? I think that's what we care about, and I'm going to show you how it works, right? Because we don't just have to think about gas, we have to think about gas and apples and oranges, right? What we want to know is if we have more of those things, not if we, not that they've just gotten more expensive. How do we do it? Here's a very simple example, the simplest one I could think of really that has an air of realism to it. And you'll see what I've done here is, I don't have apples and oranges and gas, but I have, you can think about these things as just generic goods, like put in your mind's eye a world in which there's just this thing called food, right? And that's what you're buying. So we have food, clothing, shelter, and transit. Those are my 4 products that you can buy, and you can just imagine that they're one thing for now, right? So if you want, you could have apples, shirts, hotel rooms, and bus rides or something, if you need concrete examples. Now you look at what's happened here in my 2 years. In year 1, we have 20 units produced of food, 20 of clothing, 30 of shelter, and 15 in transit, right? So however you want to think about those things, that's just some measure of how much of each of those we have, right? The units. What happens between year 1 and year 2 is what happens to most economies. There's changes, and maybe my changes here are optimistic. What has happened is all of these things have increased, right? And that's typically what happens, or at least has happened in the United States over time. Every year we can produce more than we could the year before. Now what you'll notice is that these things have all increased, but it hasn't been uniform, right? For example, clothing has gone from 20 to 25, food has gone from 20 to 22. Shelter has increased by 2 units and transit by 5 units as well. And this is also typically what happens year to year, right? Some things increase more than others, right? And it seems like we want to know about increases in general. Okay, so here I have the quantities that change over time. Well, I also have the prices of these goods I put in here. And I have this year 1P and year 2P, so we'll calculate GDP, nominal GDP in each of these years in a second. But this is the other thing that happens over time, is even as the quantities grow, so do the prices, right? There's been inflation here, put another way. Transit has gone from $2 to $3, right? Food was $4, it's at $5. Shelter has gone up by $2 in prices. So the changes in prices are also generally up, but they're different across these goods, right? So we want to think about how we can just focus in on changes in the quantities we produced, right? Okay. So before we do that, I'm just going to show you to get kind of the techniques in place. I'm going to just think about calculating GDP here. So I'll put F, C, S, and T like this, right? And our quantities are 20, 20, 30, 15. And here we have our, I'll even put a Q here, I'll call it Q1 and P1, like this. P1 we have 4, 5, 8, and 2. Isn't it kind of neat that as an economist you sort of think about, even like an accounting thing, you sort of say, let's get the principle straight with the simple model first, right? And then think about how it generalizes. So to get GDP, nominal GDP here, all we do is think about the total dollar value of everything created. Well, that's going to be $80 of food, 20 times 4, $100 of clothing, 30 times 8 is 240 of shelter, and $30 of transit. Add those things up, 340, 350, thank you, 430. Did I get that right? So that would be my reading for nominal GDP in year 1, yeah? We could do the same for year 2, right? So we'd have quantities in year 2 and prices in year 2. Same idea here. Here we have 22, 25. I'm just reading across my columns. 32, 20. Our prices are different in year 2. 5, 6, 10, 3. Like that. We do the same thing. 22 times 5 is 90? No. 110?
Yeah.
Thank you. 25 times 6 is 150. 320. And 60. Uh-oh. 380. 490.
450. Right, correct.
Yeah.
This is 450?
Yeah.
Thank you. Did I do, so far I'm okay over here? And if I add those up, what do I get? 640? Is that right? It's plausible. 380. I'm going to go with it. 640? Okay, so there we have it. Those are simple nominal GDP calculations, right? Okay, that's fine. And we can say, all right, well, nominal GDP has increased over time, 450 to 640. But as economists, what we care about is whether or not the capacity of the economy or the overall amount of production has increased. And here we've confounded two things, price changes and quantity changes. Quantity changes, we like thinking about those. Price changes, that's just our unit of measurement changing. That's a problem. So what's the way out of this problem? To get real GDP, here's an idea. Let's fix the prices. Okay? What we're going to do is we're going to say, let's just take all of our prices in year 1 and apply those in year 2. Right? Now the prices aren't changing and only the quantities are changing. How do you like that idea? That's a cool idea, right? Let's see what happens when we do that. So what I can do is everybody hopefully has this committed to memory. I'm just going to say, instead of P2, we'll use P1 here, and this will be our real GDP calculation. So we're going to take 4, 5, 8, and 2. Yep. And then prices are staying the same, and only our quantities are changing, right? So what do we get here? 88, 125. Oh man. 236? 46. 8 times 3 is 24. 8 times 236, isn't it?
No,
56? Yeah, you're right. Yep. And then 40. And can someone add those up for me quickly? Well, you don't have to do it, just,
509.
509, okay. So now we get the much more, it's a muted rate, but you can see that now we have we still can say that there's been some growth in our overall production of things. It's not as much as it was when the prices were also going up, but now we have a more honest measure, right? And that's what real GDP is. By the way, what you would call this, P1 here, it's the prices in the base year. So you'll notice whenever you look at any real GDP, well, it doesn't just have to be GDP. We're going to see that there's a lot of things you can calculate real values for. But you'll see whenever you look at this real gross domestic product numbers like this, it has see up there it says units. It says billions of 2017 dollars. So now you know. What does that mean? It means that it's fixed, the prices, as those prices as they existed in 2017, right? And now it's used those going back and forward. Yes?
So the nominal GDP, the one that takes into account the inflation, is always going to be like relatively higher than...
It's typically higher, but that's an artifact of the fact that prices have gone up over time. So one thing I might, if I have time to talk about, there have been periods in U.S. history where prices have actually fallen over time, right? A good example is in the late 1800s. At that time, the U.S. currency was pegged to the amount of gold, right? That was in circulation. And the economy was growing very rapidly, but the amount of gold out there wasn't. So prices were actually falling. And so in that sense, nominal GDP was less than real GDP, right, over time, which was kind of a weird inversion. But typically, this is how it's worked over time. And I like those questions because, once again, one of the aspects of macro you have to sort of think about is getting used to what these numbers have looked like over time, where the big events were, just sort of calibrating your brain to think about these aggregates. So that's basically how you calculate real GDP. You fix a number, and then you fix a price level. You pick a point in time and use those prices, both going backwards and forwards. One little thing I slipped past you there is you might say, well, Baker, that's great, but if you're going to go way back in time to, you've talked about 1970, there were a lot of things that we didn't even have, that you didn't have in 1970 that we have today, right? Like electric cars and cell phones, personal computers. How do you treat goods that didn't exist in the past, right, that people buy now? Well, I'll leave that one hanging for you. Take Macroeconomics 201, and you'll talk about how so-called chained price indices are formed. And indeed, you'll saw that it said 2017 chained dollars. So this is the basics of index formation, right? And this is kind of what I would like you to have in mind, that we're fixing prices in a given year and letting the quantities change. Yes?
What happens if we keep a fixed price, like the whole time? Like, let's say there's like this, because it kind of reminds me of rent control. Like, you have to keep the rent a certain price, and you can't have it move up. Like, wouldn't that hurt suppliers?
Okay, so, boy, that's a complex question. How does that factor into inflation? I'm going to say that we're going to think about that when we start to put a theory together, right? So right now we don't really have a theory as to why these prices go up or down, or why some go up and some don't. We're going to get to that, right? And we're going to think about how that changes this overall picture. But let's put that aside. That's a really good question. And I might sort of say, well, how does microeconomic policy impact things like this? And we'll get into that a little bit once we have some theory. But what I want to do along the way here is just sort of a couple of things. You might be surprised. We're going to come back to this table here. I'll throw it in there. How do we actually know what the prices were in any given year? Well, the answer is surveys, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics does a lot of surveys. There's the survey of, I think I have it here, to get the prices over time. I think it's the BLS that does that. We'll talk about it next time. But we do these surveys where you sort of look at what people buy, how much they spend on different sorts of goods, and out of this you get prices. It's kind of an astounding thing that we do it as much as we do and as regularly as we do it, because it's not easy. And indeed, there are a lot of big projects out there. I know MIT has one going, the Million Price Project, I think it's called, where you sort of try to make sense of the fact that prices of things are very different in different parts of the country even. So talking about, say, the price of shelter is hard. To use the example or the question that was asked, an apartment in New York City costs something different than an apartment in Rochester, say. So we have all these complications, but there's a big branch of economics devoted to figuring out these things. So just here, I guess I can check my calculations. I should have gone ahead here. I guess we got it right, 509 and 450, right? By the way, you'll notice that GDP in the base year, right? GDP in the year that you've decided to take the prices from, nominal and real are the same in that year. So there's another tidbit. Let me fill in my numbers again here. I'm actually going to erase this set of numbers, and I have a little trick for you. My original prices here were 5, 6, 10, and 3. So those are my prices in year 2, right, and all that stuff. It turns out we also, out of this approach to doing things, have a way of measuring how much just prices have changed, right? So we can sort of think about this as, okay, we have a way of measuring real GDP changes over time, but we can also think about how we measure pure price changes. Well, let's reverse our trick, right? Instead of fixing instead of fixing prices and look at quantities change over time, how about we do the opposite? We fix the quantity and then just look at how the costs change over time, right? So you have the same quantity and you're just tracking how much the cost of that same quantity changes over time. And this is exactly the method by which we calculate price changes, right? Is you fix a bundle of goods, you take a bunch of stuff, and then you just see how much more costly it's gotten over time. So the way we would do it in this case is we would say, all right, well, let's see here. Quantity year 1, once again our base year, we can then say, well, let's just change these quantities to the year 1 quantities. We'll take 20, 20, 30, and 15. And now we have the quantities are the same, and the prices have gone up, right? So this is 100, this is 120, 345. We add those up, 300, 420.
565.
Thank you. And we can then say stuff like the cost of a typical bunch of stuff, right, has gone up from $450 if I wanted to buy, some stuff. In year 1, it was $450, now it's $565. So we would say costs have gone up by $115, right? No change in quantities there, that's just pure price change. Shocker, that's how we measure inflation, right? You call this what I've done here is basically calculated the price deflator or the implicit price deflator as a fancy name, but that's exactly what we've done, is tracked how the cost of everything produced in year 1 has changed from year 1 to year 2. Yes?
How do they determine it throughout the years, because inflation is not the same each year?
So you basically do the same thing here. You pick a bunch of stuff, and you just sort of look at the prices that the stuff had in the past, the price it has going forward, and you just sort of look at the cost of that fixed bundle over time. Once again, you run into complications. I said that funny, complications, because people didn't buy computers in 1930, right? But there are ways of getting around that through this process of chaining. But that's essentially what you do. Here, I've taken the same quantities that I use for GDP to calculate how the costs of things have changed. That's one way to do it, right? As I say, that's the price deflator approach. But the way that the consumer price index typically works is it tracks a bundle of goods that the typical person buys over time, right? It says, here's, Baker buys 30 cups of coffee, he buys, 4 pairs of pants, a computer, this is how much it costs in year 1, this is how much that bundle of stuff would cost in year 2. Oh, and we have some sophisticated techniques that economists have dreamed up to calculate that, the coffee's getting better and the pants are, getting, I don't know if they're getting better, but, they're different, stuff like that, right? And that's essentially how we do it, right? So how am I doing on time here? Pretty good. Great. So you now know. How do we calculate real GDP? How do we calculate the change in prices? Now, one last thing here. Really what we want to do is we want to sort of get out of our, thinking about everything in dollar terms, right? We would like to be able to, if you want to think about this as just an issue of, international comparisons, we would like to think about things in terms that we can just think, we can compare Iceland and the United States, we can compare, the United States and China, whatever. You can say, well, if prices go from 450 to 565, and then the next year they go to 610, did prices increase more from year 1 to year 2 than they did from year 2 to year 3? It's hard to tell. So we want to go even further. And in so doing, what we are going to do is talk mainly about growth rates of things. Now, I know maybe some of you are saying, oh no, not more calculation. The good news is growth rates do something that gets us out of the units, right? There's a mechanical way for doing this, or for why this is the case, and I'm going to show you in a second. But they also allow us to compare things across times, across places, and all of that stuff. And will give us another set of numbers to think about. So what is a growth rate? It's just the rate of change of time of something, the rate of change of something over time. So in my example here, I had, if you think back to my, I'll go back to real GDP, right? My calculations were year 1, it was 450, was the number I had?
Yeah.
And in year 2, it was 509. Yes? Okay. So these were both, I didn't say it, but these were both in dollars. And in fact, they were both measured in year 1 dollars. Right? That was our unit of measurement. So anything that we say is kind of beholden to these particular units, right? But one way of getting out of this and to think, and if we want to talk about years 3 and 5 and 10 or whatever, is to sort of think about a way to get rid of these units. And one way of doing this is just thinking about a growth rate, right? A growth rate is just a percentage change, right? A percentage change. A percentage change, well, how do we calculate that? Let's see, percentage change. Often we use this capital delta to denote the change in our GDP. So look, we're our GDP. Doesn't it look fancy? We have fancy symbols. But really all that means is what we do is we do 509 minus 450, and then we divide that by 450. So this is the way we talk about the percentage change in GDP between these 2 years. Right? Now you'll notice that if you think about, I've gotten used to doing this, and I don't know why economists don't do this more often. My son has taken physics in high school, and they kind of do stuff like this. In the numerator, we have dollars minus dollars, right? And in the denominator, we also have dollars, right? Year one dollars, really. And then the units cancel out, so you're left with kind of a unitless measure, right? Isn't that, I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. But anyway, so you get 59 over 450, and that gives us 59. Anybody? Should I get out my chat GPT?
0.13.
0.13 or 13%, right? That would be our growth between those two periods. And of course we could say, well, 13%, if we had numbers for the next year, the year after that, we could sort of see, we could make comparisons across all those years pretty easily. Let's do just for a little bit of practice here. In 62 Soviets. This will be our final act of the day, I guess. For my price level things, we started with 450, right? I'll call it percentage change in P. Well, we had 450 as our starting year, right? What was the value? It was 560. 565, okay. So the formula for doing the growth is you take year two. You're not going to believe this, but I've already forgotten what that number was. What was it? 565, like a goldfish, minus 450 divided by 450. This is the percentage change in price over time, right? Same thing applies. The dollars cancel out. We get 115 over 450. What does that give us? 0.25, or we would say 25%. By the way, this is what we call, when we talk about an inflation rate, it's exactly that number. I would say inflation was 25% from year one to year two. Prices in general grew at a rate of 25%. So those are two things we're going to talk a lot about, right? The growth rate of the economy over time, by which I mean the growth rate of something like real GDP. But we're also going to talk about the growth rate in prices over time, right? That's inflation. And we're going to think a lot about how these things work as we move along, right? How could I forget this? Students care about this last one quite a bit, right? There's also this thing called the growth rate of your investments or of your money. Same exact idea. That's what we call an interest rate, right? Is how the value of something changes over time, right? How it grows over time. It's all growth rates: inflation, interest rates, and economic growth. So those are the big three. I think we did pretty well here. So we'll pick it up next time with all of that. Please look at your exams and complain and don't be